What if stopping to help a stranger trapped in a deadly blizzard could shatter the walls around your heart and change everything you thought you knew about life? In a remote mountain town where winter bites deep and hope feels as distant as spring, a widowed father carrying the weight of loss and responsibility encounters a mysterious woman stranded in nature's fury. He doesn't know she's hiding a secret that could transform not just his world, but an entire forgotten community struggling to survive. Neither of them could imagine how one act of compassion on the coldest night of the year would ignite a chain of events leading to healing, hope, and a love that blooms even in the harshest storms. This is a story about broken hearts finding wholeness, about how kindness creates ripples that reach farther than we ever dream, and how sometimes the people we rescue end up saving us in return. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through Thornfield Valley like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the season's first major blizzard. Lysander Shaw pulled his collar higher as he walked the short distance from Thornfield General Store to his truck, the weight of another difficult day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The store's flickering neon sign cast an amber glow across the empty parking lot, a lonely beacon in the gathering dusk of the mountain town that time seemed to have forgotten. At 34, Lysander had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years spent fixing things: broken shelves, temperamental heating systems, and the endless small disasters that came with running the only general store in a town of barely 800 souls. His dark hair, prematurely touched with silver at the temples, caught the wind as he fumbled with his keys. The lines around his green eyes had deepened over the past 3 years, etched there not by laughter, but by the quiet strain of holding everything together with determination and little else. Behind him, the warm light from the store's windows revealed rows of half-empty shelves and clearance signs that had become permanent fixtures. Thornfield General had been in his family for 2 generations, but these days it felt more like a burden than a legacy. The larger chain stores 2 towns over had slowly drained away most of his customers, leaving behind only the elderly residents, too stubborn to drive the winding mountain roads, and the handful of families too poor to shop anywhere else. Lysander slid into the driver's seat of his aging pickup truck, the engine reluctantly turning over on the 3rd try. Through the windshield, he could see the lights of home, a modest 2-story house perched on the hillside, where his 10-year-old daughter, Emma, waited for him. The thought of her always managed to soften the hard edges of his day, even when everything else felt like it was crumbling around him. Emma was the brightest spot in his increasingly gray world, a spirited girl with her mother's laugh and her own fierce independence. She had Sarah's warm brown eyes and the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Sometimes Lysander caught glimpses of his late wife and their daughter's expressions, and the resemblance was both a comfort and a knife to his heart. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, a sudden illness that had swept through their lives like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ash and memory in its wake. In those first months after her death, Lysander had barely functioned, moving through each day like a man underwater. It was Emma who had pulled him back to the surface, her need for stability and love forcing him to rebuild himself one day at a time. The house felt too quiet when he walked through the front door, though he could hear Emma's voice drifting from the kitchen where she sat at the scarred wooden table, reading aloud from her homework assignment. She looked up when he entered, her face brightening with the pure joy that only someone her age could manage after a long day. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson says there's going to be a huge storm tonight," she announced, gesturing toward the window where snow had already begun to fall in fat, lazy flakes. "She said it might be the biggest one in years." Lysander hung his coat on the hook by the door, forcing a smile despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in his bones these days. "Did she now? Well, Mrs. Henderson knows her weather." He ruffled Emma's hair as he passed, breathing in the faint scent of the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using. "What do you say we make some hot chocolate and watch the snow fall?" Emma's eyes lit up, but then her expression grew more serious. "Dad, are you okay? You look sad again." The question hit him harder than it should have. Emma had developed an uncanny ability to read his moods, a skill that both impressed and worried him. She was too young to carry the weight of his grief, yet somehow she seemed determined to share it anyway. "Just tired, sweetheart," he said, which was true enough. He was tired of struggling to keep the store afloat, tired of lying awake at night, wondering how he'd pay next month's bills, tired of feeling like he was failing at everything that mattered. But mostly, he was tired of the loneliness that had settled into his chest like a permanent winter, freezing out any possibility of warmth or joy. As they prepared hot chocolate together, Emma chattering about her day at school and her plans for the weekend, Lysander found himself looking out at the storm gathering beyond the windows. The wind was picking up, driving the snow in horizontal sheets across the valley. Weather like this had a way of isolating Thornfield even further from the outside world, cutting them off from the main highway and leaving the residents to rely on each other until the plows could get through. Tonight, as he tucked Emma into bed and listened to her prayers, she still prayed for her mother every night, asking God to keep her safe in heaven. Lysander felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him like a heavy blanket. He was all Emma had left, and some days that felt like more pressure than one man could bear. The storm outside was building into something fierce and unforgiving, the kind of blizzard that could trap travelers and turn a simple drive into a life-threatening ordeal. As Lysander stood at his bedroom window, watching the snow pile against the glass, he had no way of knowing that this particular storm would bring more than just cold and isolation to Thornfield Valley. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something. He never could have imagined a chance encounter that would crack open the frozen walls he'd built around his heart and remind him that sometimes the most unexpected storms bring exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. But for now, he was simply a man standing alone in the darkness, watching the snow fall and trying to summon the strength for another day of holding everything together. One breath at a time, the blizzard arrived with the fury of a living thing, transforming Thornfield Valley into a whiteout nightmare by the time Lysander's phone rang at 2 in the morning. He jolted awake, his heart immediately racing with the kind of panic that comes to single parents in the middle of the night. But it wasn't about Emma. She was sleeping soundly in her room, her breathing steady and peaceful. "Lysander? It's Doc Morrison." The elderly physician's voice crackled through the poor connection, barely audible over the howling wind outside. "I hate to wake you, but old Henrik Torvin's having chest pains again. His wife called, and with this storm, the ambulance can't make it up their mountain road. I've got the medication he needs, but my car won't make it in this weather." Lysander was already reaching for his clothes. Henrik lived in one of the most remote cabins in the valley, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound treacherously up the mountainside. In weather like this, it would be nearly impossible to navigate, but Henrik was a good man who'd helped Lysander countless times when the store needed repairs he couldn't afford to hire out. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Lysander said, pulling on his heaviest winter coat. He checked on Emma once more, leaving a note by her bedside, just in case she woke up, though he planned to be back long before morning. The drive to Doc Morrison's clinic through downtown Thornfield was like navigating through a frozen tunnel. The wind drove snow so thick that his headlights barely penetrated 3 feet ahead, and even with 4-wheel drive, his truck slipped and slid on the rapidly accumulating snow. The town's few streetlights created ghostly halos in the swirling white chaos, and not another soul was visible on the roads. Doc Morrison was waiting with a medical bag and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the frigid air. "You sure about this, son? That mountain road's going to be treacherous." "Henrik would do the same for me," Lysander replied, accepting the bag and securing it safely in his truck. I'll take it slow. The old physician gripped his shoulder. Be careful out there. This storm's worse than anything we've seen in years. The road up to Henrik's cabin was a test of both skill and nerve. Lysander had driven these mountains his entire life, but tonight felt different, more dangerous, more unforgiving. The truck's tires fought for purchase on the increasingly steep incline, and more than once he felt the vehicle slide sideways before regaining traction. The windshield wipers worked overtime, but ice kept forming faster than they could clear it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was about halfway up the mountain when his headlights caught something that made him hit the brakes, a dark shape partially buried in a snowdrift on the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or debris, but as he peered through the storm, his blood ran cold. It was a car, and it was nearly invisible under the accumulating snow. Lysander grabbed his flashlight and struggled out into the blizzard, the wind immediately trying to knock him off his feet. The cold hit his face like a physical blow, and within seconds, his beard was crusted with ice. He fought his way to the vehicle, a sedan that clearly wasn't equipped for mountain winter. Driving and used his flashlight to peer through the snow-covered windows. Inside, he could make out a figure slumped over the steering wheel. "Hey!" he shouted, banging on the driver's side window. "Can you hear me?" The figure stirred slightly, and Lysander's heart leaped with relief. Whoever was inside was alive, but the car's engine was off, and in this cold, hypothermia would set in quickly. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, yanking it open against the resistance of the wind. The woman inside lifted her head slowly, her dark hair disheveled and her lips already showing a bluish tinge. She was young, maybe late 20s, with delicate features and eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She wore an expensive-looking coat that was clearly designed more for city winters than mountain blizzards. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I think I took a wrong turn. My phone died, and I couldn't see ... The road just disappeared." "It's okay," Lysander said, his emergency training from years of mountain living kicking in. "I'm going to get you out of here. Can you move?" She nodded weakly, though her movements were sluggish, a clear sign that the cold was affecting her cognition. Lysander helped her out of the car, noting that she was wearing thin city shoes that would be useless in the snow. Without hesitation, he swept her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt. "My name's Lysander," he said as he carried her toward his truck, fighting against the wind with each step. "What's yours?" "Kellen," she managed, her head resting against his shoulder. "Kellen Vance." The name meant nothing to him, but there was something about her voice, educated, refined, completely out of place in these mountains, that suggested she was a long way from home. Questions could wait, though. Right now, the priority was getting them both to safety. He managed to get her into the passenger seat of his truck and cranked up the heat. Wrapping her in the emergency blanket he kept behind the seat. Her shivering was violent now, but that was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting the cold. "I need to make one stop," he explained, handing her the thermos of coffee Doc Morrison had given him. "There's a sick man up the mountain who needs medication. Then I'll get you somewhere warm." Kellen nodded, her fingers wrapped around the thermos like it was a lifeline. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in her voice, a depth of gratitude that suggested she understood exactly how close she'd come to dying on that mountain road. As Lysander carefully maneuvered his truck back onto the treacherous road, he found himself stealing glances at the mysterious woman beside him. She was clearly not from around here. Everything about her, from her clothes to her speech, spoke of a different world entirely. But the storm had brought her to him, and for now, that was all that mattered. Henrik's medication was delivered successfully, the old man's chest pain subsiding once Doc Morrison's treatment took effect. But as they made their way back down the mountain through the still raging blizzard, Lysander couldn't shake the feeling that this night was going to change everything. Though he had no idea how right he was, Doc, by the time they reached Lysander's house, the blizzard had transformed Thornfield Valley into an alien landscape. Snowdrifts were already climbing halfway up his front porch, and the wind howled with such ferocity that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the old house. Lysander parked as close to the front door as possible, but they still had to fight their way through knee-deep snow to reach the shelter of the covered porch. Kellen stumbled twice, her city shoes providing no traction whatsoever, and each time Lysander steadied her with a gentle but firm grip on her arm. She was still shivering despite the truck's heat, and he could see that exhaustion was setting in now that the immediate danger had passed. Her face was pale except for 2 spots of red on her cheeks, and her breathing was still slightly labored. "I should take you to the clinic," Lysander said as he fumbled with his keys, but Kellen shook her head quickly. "Please no," she said, her voice stronger now but still carrying an edge of something he couldn't quite identify. "I just need to warm up. I don't want to be any more trouble than I already am." There was something in her tone, not quite fear, but a reluctance that went beyond simple embarrassment at needing help. Lysander filed the observation away but didn't press. In his experience, people had their reasons for avoiding official attention, and it wasn't his place to judge. Inside, the house felt almost unnaturally warm after the brutal cold outside. Lysander immediately guided Kellen to the living room, where the embers of the evening's fire still glowed in the stone fireplace. He quickly built up the flames while she stood uncertainly in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the worn but comfortable armchair closest to the fire. "I'll get you some dry clothes and something hot to drink." Kellen lowered herself into the chair with visible relief, though Lysander noticed how she perched on the edge, as if ready to flee at any moment. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the family photos on the mantel, the pile of Emma's books scattered on the coffee table. Everything was clean but clearly well used, the kind of home where people actually lived rather than simply existed. "You have a beautiful home," she said when he returned with a pair of Sarah's old sweatpants and one of his flannel shirts. The clothes would be too big for her, but they'd be warm and dry. "It's not much," Lysander replied, setting the clothes on the arm of her chair. "But it's ours. The bathroom's just down the hall if you want to change. I'll put some soup on." When Kellen emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable in the oversized clothes. Her dark hair was damp from washing, and without her makeup, Lysander could see the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes. But there was also something else, a natural beauty that didn't need enhancement, and an intelligence in her gaze that suggested depths he hadn't expected. They were sitting in the kitchen, sharing bowls of heated-up vegetable soup, when Emma appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Dad?" she said, then stopped short when she noticed Kellen. "Oh, hello." "Hey, sweetheart," Lysander said gently. "I'm sorry if we woke you. This is Kellen. She got caught in the storm, so she's going to stay here tonight." Emma studied their unexpected guest with the unself-conscious curiosity of youth. "Are you okay? You look really tired." Kellen smiled, and Lysander was surprised by how genuine it seemed. "I am tired. Your dad saved my life tonight. My car got stuck in the snow, and I probably would have frozen if he hadn't found me." "Dad's good at helping people," Emma said matter-of-factly, climbing onto the chair next to Lysander. "He helped Mrs. Chun fix her roof last month, and he always carries groceries for old Mr. Wild when his arthritis is bad." "Emma," Lysander said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "What? It's true." Emma turned back to Kellen. "Where are you from?" "You talk different." Kellen hesitated for just a moment. "Chicago. I was traveling through Chicago. Emma's eyes widened. That's a really big city, isn't it? Do you live in one of those tall buildings? I do, Kellen said, though something in her expression suggested the topic wasn't entirely welcome. What's it like? I've never been anywhere bigger than Millbrook, and that's just 2 towns over. Lysander watched the exchange with growing fascination. Emma had a gift for drawing people out, but Kellen seemed genuinely engaged rather than just politely tolerating the questions. There was a warmth in her voice when she spoke to Emma that hadn't been there when she talked to him. It's very different from here, Kellen said carefully. Lots of noise, lots of people. Everything moves very fast. Sometimes ... She paused, looking out the window where the snow continued to fall. Sometimes it can feel lonely, even when you're surrounded by millions of people. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than perhaps she'd intended. Lysander found himself studying her profile in the soft kitchen light, wondering what had brought a woman from Chicago's fast-paced world to a mountain road in the middle of a blizzard. I think I'd like the city, Emma said thoughtfully. But I'd miss the mountains, and I'd miss knowing everyone. You're lucky, Kellen said quietly. Growing up somewhere where people know your name, where they care about you, that's special. There was a wistfulness in her voice that made Lysander's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. Whatever Kellen Vance's story was, it clearly involved more than just getting lost in a snowstorm. Emma yawned, and Lysander stood to guide her back to bed. Come on, Bug. It's way past your bedtime. Can Kellen tell me about Chicago tomorrow? Emma asked hopefully. If she's still here tomorrow, Lysander said, though something in him hoped she would be. We'll see what the weather looks like. When he returned to the kitchen after tucking Emma in, Kellen was standing by the window, watching the storm rage outside. Her shoulders were tense, and he could see the exhaustion weighing on her despite the warm clothes and hot food. You can take Emma's room, he said. I'll sleep on the couch. Kellen turned, and for a moment he thought she might argue, but then she simply nodded. Thank you for everything. I know having a stranger in your house isn't what you planned for tonight. Life rarely goes according to plan, Lysander replied, thinking of Sarah, of the store's struggles, of all the ways his own life had veered. Of course, but sometimes that's not entirely a bad thing. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something passed between them, not romantic. Not yet, but a recognition of shared understanding. They were both people carrying burdens, both navigating storms that had nothing to do with weather. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on Thornfield Valley, but inside the warm kitchen, 2 strangers had begun the delicate process of becoming something more. Morning arrived in Thornfield Valley with an almost supernatural quiet, the kind that only comes after a blizzard has exhausted itself. Lysander woke on the living room couch to find nearly 3 feet of snow pressed against the windows, transforming the familiar landscape into something from a fairy tale. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a world of pristine white under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. He found Kellen in the kitchen, already dressed in her own clothes, somehow cleaned and dried overnight, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in her hands. She'd found the coffee maker and figured out how to use it, which impressed him more than it probably should have. There was something different about her this morning, a stillness that suggested she'd slept better than expected. Good morning, she said softly, turning with a small smile. I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, so I made coffee. Mind? You probably saved my life. I'm not functional without caffeine. Lysander stretched, working out the kinks from a night on the couch. How are you feeling? Much better, thanks to you. She gestured toward the window. It's beautiful, isn't it? I've never seen snow like this so untouched. Emma bounded into the kitchen before Lysander could respond, already dressed and radiating the kind of energy that only youth could muster. After a big storm, Dad, look outside. We're totally snowed in. Do you think school's canceled? I'd say that's a safe bet, Lysander said, ruffling her hair. The plows won't be able to get through until this afternoon at the earliest. Emma's excitement was infectious, and Lysander caught Kellen smiling genuinely for the first time since he'd found her. What do people do when they're snowed in? Kellen asked. Well, Emma said importantly, first we have to dig out the truck and clear the driveway. Then we check on neighbors to make sure everyone's okay. And then maybe we can build a snowman. Lysander was about to suggest that Kellen probably didn't need to help with the heavy work, but she spoke before he could. I'd like to help. I mean, if you don't mind having an amateur along. An hour later, they were all bundled up and attacking the enormous job of digging out. Kellen had borrowed some of Sarah's old winter gear, and while she was clearly unaccustomed to physical labor, she threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised Lysander. She didn't complain when her back started aching or when her hands got cold, despite the thick gloves. Instead, she asked questions about the best techniques for shoveling, listened carefully to his answers, and gradually found her rhythm. You're getting the hang of it, Lysander said as they worked side by side to clear a path to his truck. It's oddly satisfying, Kellen admitted, pausing to catch her breath. I spend most of my time sitting in meetings or staring at computer screens. This is different. What kind of work do you do? Emma asked, taking a break from building what was shaping up to be an impressively large snowman. Kellen hesitated. For just a moment, business consulting. Nothing very exciting. It was a vague answer, but Lysander didn't push. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, and Kellen had been through enough without being interrogated about her career. By noon, they'd made enough progress to get the truck out, and Lysander suggested they make the rounds to check on neighbors. It was a Thornfield tradition after big storms, making sure the elderly residents were safe and had everything they needed. Their first stop was Mrs. Patterson's small house at the end of Elm Street. The 78-year-old widow met them at the door with obvious relief, having been without power since the early morning hours of the storm. Lysander, thank goodness, she said, ushering them inside. The furnace went out about 3 hours ago, and I can't get it to restart. It was a simple fix, a tripped circuit breaker that Mrs. Patterson hadn't known how to reset, but it would have been dangerous for her to go much longer without heat. While Lysander worked on the furnace, Kellen found herself in conversation with the older woman, listening to stories about Thornfield's history and the neighbors who'd helped raise Emma after her mother's death. This young man's been a godsend to this community, Mrs. Patterson said, nodding toward Lysander. Always the first to help when someone's in trouble. Kellen watched Lysander as he patiently explained to Mrs. Patterson how to reset the breaker if it happened again, his voice gentle and clear. There was no impatience in his manner, no sense that he had better things to do. She found herself thinking about the executives she knew in Chicago, people who would consider this kind of hands-on help beneath them, who would write a check. Instead of getting their hands dirty, their next stop was the Brennan family's farm on the outskirts of town. Jack Brennan had injured his back the previous week, and his wife Maria was struggling to manage the livestock and clear the snow by herself. Lysander immediately pitched in to help with the barn chores, while Kellen surprised everyone, including herself, by offering to help Maria with the morning milking. I've never done this before, Kellen admitted as Maria showed her how to approach the gentle Holstein cow. Nothing to it, Maria said with a laugh. Bessie here's been doing this longer than you've been alive. Just be confident and gentle. To everyone's amazement, Kellen took to it naturally. There was something almost meditative about the rhythm of milking, the warmth of the barn, the soft sounds of the animals. For the first time in months, her mind felt quiet, free from the constant chatter of deadlines and strategies and corporate politics. You're a natural, Maria said approvingly. Most city folk are afraid to even touch the cows. As they worked together, Kellen found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. There was something profoundly satisfying about this kind of work, immediate, tangible, useful. Nobody was questioning her decisions or challenging her authority or trying to undermine her position. She was simply helping, and being helpful felt like a gift she'd forgotten how to give. On the drive back to the house, Emma chattering excitedly about their adventures, Lysander glanced over at Kellen. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold air and physical activity, and there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "You did good today," he said simply. Kellen turned to meet his gaze, and something warm spread through her chest. It felt good. I can't remember the last time I felt useful, like what I was doing actually mattered. "Everything matters," Emma piped up from the back seat. "Mom used to say that even little things can change everything." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lysander felt a familiar pang at the mention of Sarah, but for the first time, it was accompanied by something else, a sense that maybe Emma was right, that maybe small acts of kindness really could change everything. As they pulled into his driveway, Kellen realized that something fundamental had shifted during the day. She wasn't just a stranded traveler anymore, grateful for shelter. She was beginning to feel like part of something, a community, a family, a life that made sense in ways her Chicago existence never had. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't thinking about leaving. The third morning of Kellen's stay dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered valley look like something from a postcard. The roads had finally been plowed, and cell service had returned to the area, though Kellen seemed oddly reluctant to check her phone when the signal bars reappeared. Lysander noticed her hesitation as they sat around the breakfast table, Emma chattering about her plans to build an even bigger snowman now that the weather had cleared. Kellen's phone had been buzzing intermittently for the past hour, but she'd been ignoring it, her expression growing more tense with each notification. "You should probably check those," Lysander said gently. "People might be worried about you." Kellen's smile was strained. "I'm sure it's just work. Nothing that can't wait. Can't wait." But even as she said it, the phone rang again, the sharp sound cutting through the peaceful morning atmosphere. This time, the caller didn't give up after a few rings. The phone continued its insistent buzzing until Kellen finally sighed and picked it up. "I should take this," she said, her voice suddenly formal in a way that reminded Lysander how different she was from anyone in Thornfield. "Excuse me." She stepped out onto the back porch, and though Lysander tried not to eavesdrop, the urgency in her voice was impossible to ignore. He caught fragments through the window words like acquisition, timeline, and board meeting that meant nothing to him, but clearly carried weight in her world. Emma looked up from her coloring book. "She sounds upset." Lysander nodded, a strange uneasiness settling in his stomach. For 3 days, Kellen had seemed like someone seeking refuge from a complicated life. But the tone of that phone conversation suggested complications he hadn't imagined. When Kellen returned to the kitchen 20 minutes later, her face was pale and her hands were shaking slightly. She sat down heavily at the table, staring at her coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions she didn't want to ask. "Everything okay?" Lysander asked. Kellen started, then stopped. She looked at Emma, who was watching with the intuitive concern that seemed to come naturally to her, then back at Lysander. "I need to tell you something. About why I was really on that mountain road." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Lysander felt his chest tighten with anticipation he didn't understand. "I wasn't just driving through," Kellen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was coming here, to Thornfield Valley. For work," Lysander frowned. "What kind of work brings someone from Chicago to Thornfield?" Kellen took a shaky breath. "I work for Meridian Development Corporation. We specialize in rural revitalization projects." The name meant nothing to Lysander, But something in Callan's tone made it sound ominous. What does that mean, exactly? We identify small towns that are struggling economically, Callan said, each word seeming to cost her. Places where property values are low, where businesses are failing, where people are leaving. Then we buy up the land and develop it into something more profitable, usually resort communities or commercial centers. The words hit Lysander like a physical blow. You buy up towns? We revitalize them, Callan said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. We bring in jobs, tourism, economic growth, by forcing out the people who've lived there for generations. Lysander's voice was quiet, but Emma looked up sharply at the change in his tone. Callan's silence was answer enough. So you came here to what, scout us out? Figure out how much our homes are worth. The betrayal in Lysander's voice was unmistakable now. 3 days of helping with chores and milking cows, and all the while you were calculating how to destroy our community. No. Callan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. It wasn't like that. When I first came here, yes, it was for work. But then the storm happened, and you saved me, and I saw what this place really is. What you people really are. What we people really are. Lysander repeated, standing as well. You mean poor? Easy targets? Dad? Emma's small voice cut through the tension. What's happening? Lysander looked at his daughter, seeing the confusion and worry in her eyes, and felt his anger crystallize into something harder and colder. This was exactly why he didn't trust Isley, why he'd built walls around his heart. Because people like... Callan Vance looked at places like Thornfield and saw opportunity, not home. I think maybe it's time for you to leave, he said quietly. Lysander, please, let me explain. Explain what? That you've been lying to us since the moment you got here. That while we were treating you like family, you were figuring out how to price our land. Callan's eyes filled with tears. I haven't lied about anything that matters. Everything I told you about feeling lonely, about finding something here I never knew I was missing, that was all true. But you didn't tell us why you were really here. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. Callan's voice cracked. I knew you'd assume the worst without giving me a chance to explain. The worst? Lysander's laugh was bitter. Lady, I don't think there is anything worse than what you just told me. You work for a company that destroys places like this for profit. I worked for that company. Callan corrected, her voice growing stronger. Past tense, that phone call? That was my assistant telling me that if I don't return to Chicago immediately, the board is going to fire me for abandoning a major project. And you know what? I don't care. Lysander stared at her, thrown off balance by the declaration. I don't care because somewhere between milking Maria's cow and listening to Mrs. Patterson's stories and watching Emma build snowmen, I remembered what it feels like to be part of something real, Callan continued. I remembered what it feels like to matter to people, not because of what I can do for them or how much money I can make them, but just because I showed up. Emma had been watching this exchange with growing distress, and now she spoke up in a small voice. Are you leaving, Callan? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Callan's composure cracked completely. I don't want to, she whispered. But you are, Lysander said, and it wasn't a question. Because that's what people like you do. You come into places like this, you shake everything up, and then you leave. People like me? Callan's voice was sharp now. What kind of person do you think I am? I think you're someone who's very good at telling people what they want to hear, Lysander replied. I think you're someone who's used to getting what you want, and right now what you want is to feel better about yourself and your company by playing house with the simple mountain folk. The accusation hit its mark. Callan flinched as if he'd slapped her, and for a moment she just stood there, absorbing the pain of his words. You're right, she said finally. I am good at telling people what they want to hear. It's how I've survived in a world that would have eaten me alive otherwise. But everything I've told you and Emma has been the truth. The only lie I told was the lie of omission, not telling you why I came here in the first place." She looked at Emma, who was watching with tears in her eyes, then back at Lysander. "I came here to do a job that would have destroyed everything you love about this place. But I can't do that job now. I won't do it, even if it costs me everything else." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the sun continued to shine on the pristine snow, oblivious to the human drama playing out in the warm kitchen. Finally, Lysander spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "I think you should pack your things." Kellen nodded, her face pale but composed. "I understand." As she walked toward the stairs, Emma called after her, "Kellen?" She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes. "Will you write to me?" Emma asked, "so I know you're okay." Kellen's composure finally broke completely. "If your father says it's all right." She managed through her tears. Lysander didn't say anything at all. The house felt different after Kellen left, not just quieter, but somehow smaller, as if her presence had expanded the very walls and her absence had allowed them to contract again. Lysander stood at the kitchen window, watching her rental car navigate the plowed road down the mountain, and tried to convince himself that the hollow feeling in his chest was relief rather than loss. Emma had retreated to her room after Kellen's departure, claiming she had homework to catch up on, but Lysander could hear her crying softly through the thin walls. The sound was a knife to his heart, reminding him that his decisions didn't just affect him, they affected the daughter who had clearly grown attached to their unexpected guest. By evening, when Emma finally emerged red-eyed and silent for dinner, the tension in the house was unbearable. They ate their meal in uncomfortable quiet, the absence of Kellen's voice and laugh making their usual conversations feel forced and hollow. "She didn't want to leave," Emma said suddenly, pushing mashed potatoes around her plate without eating them. Lysander set down his fork carefully. "Sometimes people don't have a choice." She said she had a choice. She said she chose us over her job. "Emma, you didn't believe her. It wasn't a question." Emma's brown eyes, so much like her mother's, were filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. "You thought she was lying." Lysander struggled to find words that would make sense to a 10-year-old. Words that would explain the complexity of trust and betrayal and the way people could be sincere about their feelings while still being fundamentally dishonest about their intentions. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Mom always said that when grown-ups say something is complicated, it usually means they're scared." The observation hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had said that, usually when she was gently calling him out on his tendency to overthink rather than feel, to analyze rather than trust. That night, after Emma had gone to bed with a stiff goodnight that spoke volumes about her disappointment, in him, Lysander found himself unable to sleep. He sat in the living room where Kellen had spent her first night, staring at the fire and replaying their last conversation over and over in his mind. The truth was, he had been scared. Scared of being fooled, scared of opening his heart to someone who would inevitably leave, scared of letting Emma get attached to someone who wasn't permanent. The revelation about Kellen's job had felt like vindication of all his fears, proof that he'd been right to keep his distance, right to protect himself and his daughter from disappointment. But as the hours passed, other memories surfaced. The genuine wonder in Kellen's voice when she talked about the community spirit in Thornfield. The way she'd thrown herself into helping with the snow removal, even though her back ached and her hands got cold. The natural tenderness she'd shown with Mrs. Patterson. The easy way she'd learned to milk cows with Maria Brennan. Had all of that been an act? Could someone fake that kind of authentic engagement, that obvious joy in simple tasks and honest work? The next morning brought more complications in the form of Doc Morrison, who appeared at Lysander's door with a concerned expression and a thermos of coffee. "Heard we had some excitement while I was snowed in at the clinic," the older man sighed. settling into the kitchen chair that had become Kellen's usual spot. Mrs. Patterson called me about the young woman who helped fix her furnace. Lysander poured himself coffee and waited. Doc Morrison had a way of getting to his point in his own time, and pushing him never helped. She spoke very highly of your houseguest, Doc continued. Said she was the most genuinely caring person she'd met in years. Funny thing though, when I mentioned that to Maria Brennan at the grocery store, she said the same thing. Used almost the exact same words. Your point, Doc? My point is that in 40 years of practicing medicine, I've gotten pretty good at reading people. And according to everyone who met this woman, she wasn't putting on an act, she was real. Lysander stared into his coffee mug. She lied about why she was here. Did she? Or did she just not tell you everything right away? Doc Morrison's gray eyes were kind but shrewd. Son, I've known you since you were Emma's age. You're one of the most decent men I know, but you've got a tendency to see betrayal where there might just be complicated truth. Before Lysander could respond, there was a knock at the front door. When he opened it, he found Maria Brennan standing on his porch with a covered dish and a determined expression. This is for you and Emma, she said, thrusting the casserole into his hands. And this conversation is for you. Maria followed him into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation, nodding to Doc Morrison as if she'd expected to find him there. That woman, Maria said without preamble, taught my daughter more about confidence and trying new things in one morning than she's learned in months. Anna hasn't stopped talking about how Kellen wasn't afraid to fail at milking, how she laughed when Bessie knocked over the bucket and just tried again. Maria, I'm not finished. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 5 strong-willed teenagers and wasn't about to be interrupted by one stubborn man. I asked Anna what she thought of Kellen, and you know what she said? She said Kellen looked sad but tried to hide it, like she was used to hiding how she really felt. The words hit Lysander with unexpected force. He thought about Kellen's carefully controlled expressions, the way she sometimes seemed to catch herself before saying something too revealing, the loneliness she'd admitted to on that first night. Furthermore, Maria continued, I called my sister in Denver. She works for a consulting firm, knows about these development companies. According to her, the kind of person they send to scout rural areas is usually some junior executive looking to make a name for themselves. They don't send senior partners on preliminary assessments. Doc Morrison leaned forward with interest. Meaning? Meaning if this Kellen woman was important enough to have a board of directors threatening to fire her, she wasn't just some scout. She was someone with real power in that company. Someone who could have made decisions about what happened to Thornfield. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If Kellen had been a senior executive at Meridian Development, her decision to walk away from the project would have carried real weight. It wouldn't have been just an employee quitting. It would have been someone with authority choosing to protect Thornfield rather than profit from it. You're saying I was wrong about her, Lysander said quietly. I'm saying maybe you were wrong about her motivations, Maria replied gently. And maybe, just maybe, you let your fear make the decision instead of your heart. After his visitors left, Lysander found himself standing in Emma's doorway, watching her color at her desk. She looked up when she noticed him, her expression carefully neutral. Dad, are you okay? The question turned everything upside down. His 10-year-old daughter was asking if he was okay, when he should have been comforting her disappointment. When he should have been explaining why sometimes adults made mistakes, why sometimes fear made people push away the very things they needed most. I think, Lysander said slowly, I might have made a mistake. Emma set down her crayon and looked at him with Sarah's eyes, wise beyond her years. Are you going to fix it? Looking at his daughter, thinking about Kellen's tears as she left, remembering the genuine joy in her voice when she talked about belonging somewhere, Lysander realized that maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. I'm going to try, he said. 3 days after Kellen's departure, the letter arrived. Lysander found it mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements, but the crisp white envelope with the embossed Meridian Development Corporation logo stood out like a warning. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, though he told himself it was just the morning cold. The letter was brief and devastatingly efficient. Dear property owner, Meridian Development Corporation is pleased to announce our upcoming Thornfield Valley Revitalization Project. As part of our preliminary assessment, we will be conducting property evaluations and community meetings over the next 2 weeks. Our representatives will be contacting you soon to discuss acquisition opportunities that will benefit both you and the future economic development of your region. We look forward to working with you to bring prosperity and growth to Thornfield Valley. Sincerely, Richard Cromwell, Senior Vice President, Rural Development. Lysander read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. Meridian was moving forward with their plans, apparently unfazed by whatever Kellen's departure had meant to their timeline. The casual tone of the letter, with its talk of acquisition opportunities and revitalization, made his blood run cold. By noon, it became clear that every property owner in Thornfield had received an identical letter. Lysander's phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd opened the store, with worried neighbors calling to ask if he'd gotten the same notice, if he knew what it meant, if there was anything they could do to stop it. The most heartbreaking call came from Mrs. Patterson, her elderly voice shaking as she read him portions of her letter. They want to schedule a meeting to discuss relocation assistance, she said. Lysander, I was born in this house. My husband died in this house. I don't want relocation assistance. I want them to leave me alone. By the time Lysander closed the store that evening, his hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He'd spent the day listening to his neighbors' fears, watching the worry lines deepen on familiar faces, seeing the community he'd grown up in begin to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Henrik Torvin had mentioned selling rather than fighting. The Brennan family was already looking into property values in neighboring counties. Even Doc Morrison, who'd been in Thornfield for 40 years, was talking about early retirement. It was Emma who finally forced him to confront the obvious solution. Why don't you call Kellen? She asked over dinner, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that only someone her age could manage when discussing something that had the adults in complete turmoil. Emma, she knows about these people, doesn't she? She used to work for them. Maybe she knows how to stop them. Lysander set down his fork, looking at his daughter's earnest face. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Why not? You said you made a mistake. She said she chose us over them. Maybe now you can choose her over being scared. The words hit him like a physical blow, partly because they were delivered with such gentle certainty, and partly because they were absolutely right. He had been scared, not just of trusting Kellen, but of needing anyone, of admitting that some problems were too big to solve alone. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Lysander sat in his living room with Kellen's business card in his hands. She'd left it on the kitchen counter before departing, and he'd found it there the next morning like a question mark, punctuating their unfinished conversation. He dialed her number 3 times before finally letting it ring. Lysander? Her voice was breathless, as if she'd been running to answer the phone, and just hearing her say his name sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. We got letters, he said without preamble. From your company. They're moving forward with the project. There was a long pause, and when Kellen spoke again, her voice was tight with controlled fury. When? They want to start property evaluations. Next week, community meetings to follow. He took a breath. Kellen, I don't know how to fight this. None of us do. We're just people trying to live our lives, and they're a corporation with lawyers and money, and I'm coming back, she interrupted. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice was stronger now, filled with a determination he'd heard before, but never fully understood. I know how these people think, Lysander. I know their strategies, their timelines, their pressure points. And I know things about this particular project that they probably hope I've forgotten. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it was almost physical. Are you sure? This could get ugly. They're not going to appreciate interference from a former employee. Kellen's laugh was sharp, but not without humor. They fired me yesterday, officially, for abandoning my professional responsibilities and failing to complete a contracted assessment. So I'm not a former employee anymore. I'm just someone who cares about Thornfield and knows where all their bodies are buried. Bodies? Metaphorically speaking. Environmental impact shortcuts, community displacement protocols they'd rather keep quiet, financial projections that don't quite add up the way they claim. When you've been on the inside of these operations, you learn where the weak spots are. 2 hours later, Lysander found himself standing in his driveway as Kellen's headlights cut through the darkness. She'd driven straight through from Chicago, arriving just before midnight with a laptop bag, a suitcase, and a file box that she handled like it contained explosive materials. Emma appeared at the front door in her pajamas, having apparently been listening for the car despite being supposedly asleep. "Kellen," she called, running down the porch steps without regard for the cold or her bare feet. Kellen dropped her bags and caught Emma in a fierce hug, and Lysander saw tears streaming down, both their faces in the porch light. "I'm back," Kellen whispered into Emma's hair. "I'm back and I'm not leaving again." When Emma finally released her and ran back inside to get warm, Kellen and Lysander stood facing each other in the cold night air. There were 1,000 things that needed to be said, apologies and explanations and admissions of fear and hope, but right now none of that mattered. "Thank you," Lysander said simply, "for coming back, for being willing to fight for us." Kellen stepped closer, and in the soft light from the house, he could see the exhaustion and determination warring in her expression. "I'm not just fighting for Thornfield," she said quietly. "I'm fighting for us. For this." She gestured between them, encompassing the house, Emma's laughter from inside, the life that had somehow begun to form around them. "If you'll let me." Lysander reached out and took her cold hands in his warm ones. "We'll fight them together," he said, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the word "together" didn't frighten him. Inside the house, Emma was already setting up the couch with blankets, humming contentedly as she prepared Kellen's bed. Tomorrow would bring battles and strategies and legal complexities, none of them fully understood. But tonight, for the first time in days, Thornfield Valley felt like home again. The emergency town meeting was called for 7 o'clock on Saturday evening at the Thornfield Community Center, a modest building that hadn't seen this many people in its walls since the Christmas pageant 3 years ago. Lysander arrived early with Kellen and Emma, wanting to set up the presentation materials Kellen had spent the past 2 days preparing. The file box she'd brought from Chicago had yielded a treasure trove of information about Meridian Development's practices, their financial vulnerabilities, and most importantly, their legal obligations under environmental and community impact. Laws. As residents filed in, stamping snow from their boots and unwinding scarves, Lysander watched their faces carefully. There was fear, certainly, but also curiosity as they noticed Kellen setting up a laptop and projector with the efficiency of someone who'd given countless corporate presentations. Word had spread quickly through this small town that the mysterious woman who'd helped during the blizzard was back, and that she had inside information about the company threatening their homes. Doc Morrison was among the first to arrive, followed closely by Maria and Jack Brennan with their teenage daughter, Anna, in tow. Mrs. Patterson came in supported by her neighbor, determination etched in every line of her elderly face. Henrik Torvin, despite his recent health scare, had insisted on attending, claiming that at 78 years old, he wasn't about to let some corporation scare him out of the home he'd built with his own hands. By 7 o'clock, nearly every Adult in Thornfield was present, along with several teenagers who'd convinced their parents that their futures were at stake too. The air was thick with nervous energy and the kind of community solidarity that only emerged in times of crisis. Lysander stood up first, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "I know you all got the same letter." "I did," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "I know you're all scared about what it means for our families, our homes, our way of life. But before we talk about fighting back, I need to tell you something about Kellen Vance." All eyes turned to Kellen, who sat calmly at the front table despite the scrutiny. She dressed simply jeans and a wool sweater that belonged more in Thornfield than in any Chicago boardroom, but her posture radiated quiet confidence. "Some of you might have heard rumors about why she was here originally," Lysander continued. "The truth is, she came to Thornfield as a representative of Meridian Development Corporation. She was supposed to assess our town for their acquisition project." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Lysander held up his hand. "But that's not why she stayed. And it's not why she's here tonight." He looked directly at Kellen, and something passed between them, not just understanding, but a shared commitment that went deeper than strategy or tactics. "She stayed because she saw what we all know about this place. That it's not just a collection of buildings and property values. It's home. It's community. It's everything that matters about living a life connected to something bigger than yourself." Kellen stood up, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the room. "Lysander's right. I came here to do a job that would have destroyed everything you've built. But what I found instead was something I'd been searching for my entire life without even knowing it. I found a place where people show up for each other, where your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your title, but by your willingness to help when help is needed." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing Meridian's corporate structure and financial projections. "I spent 8 years working for companies like Meridian. I know how they think, how they operate, and most importantly, how they can be stopped. But I want to be clear about something before we go any further." She turned away from the screen to face the crowd directly. "I'm not here as a consultant or an expert brought in to save you. I'm here as someone who wants to make Thornfield my home. Permanently, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Mrs. Patterson's voice rang out from the middle of the room. "Of course we'll have you, dear. You're already one of us." The murmur of agreement that followed was warm and genuine, and Lysander felt something tight in his chest finally loosen completely. This was what he'd been afraid of losing, not just his house or his business, but this sense of belonging, of being part of something that mattered. "Furthermore," Kellen continued, her voice growing stronger with the community's acceptance, "I want you all to know that I'm not doing this alone. Lysander and I," she looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "we're doing this together. As partners, in every sense of the word." The declaration sent another ripple through the crowd, but this one was filled with warmth and approval. Emma, who'd been sitting quietly in the front row, clapped her hands together with obvious delight. Lysander stood up and moved to stand beside Kellen, their hands finding each other naturally. "What Kellen's trying to say," he said with a slight smile, "is that we're planning to get married. Assuming she say yes when I ask her properly." The laughter and applause that erupted from the crowd was genuine and joyful, the kind of celebration that small communities excelled at. But underneath the congratulations, there was something deeper, a recognition that this wasn't just about two people finding love, but about someone choosing to commit their life to preserving and protecting what Thornfield represented. When the noise died down, Kellen clicked to the next slide. "Now, let's talk about how we're going to beat Meridian at their own game." For the next hour, she walked them through Meridian's strategy, their timeline, and their vulnerabilities. She explained environmental impact requirements they'd tried to shortcut in other projects, community notification laws they'd violated, and financial projections that depended on acquiring properties at below market prices through pressure tactics. The key, she explained, is that they're counting on us to act like scared individuals rather than an organized community. They want us to make quick decisions based on fear rather than taking the time to understand our rights and options. Jack. Brennan raised his hand. What about legal representation? We can't fight a corporation without lawyers, Kellen smiled. That's where my Chicago connections become useful. I know attorneys who specialize in exactly this kind of case and who work on contingency for communities fighting corporate land grabs. I've already made some calls. As the meeting wound down, the mood in the room had shifted from fear to determination. People were volunteering for committees, sharing contact information, making plans to meet throughout the week. This wasn't just about stopping Meridian anymore. It was about strengthening the community bonds that made Thornfield worth saving in the first place. As the crowd dispersed into the cold night air, Lysander found himself standing with Kellen and Emma outside the community center, watching their neighbors walk home under the star-filled mountain sky. Are you sure about this? He asked Kellen quietly. Fighting them is going to be hard enough. But staying here, building a life here, it's so different from what you're used to. Kellen squeezed his hand, then reached down to take Emma's hand as well, creating a circle of connection that felt as natural as breathing. I've spent my whole life building other people's dreams, she said. For the first time, I want to build my own. Here, with you, with all of this. Emma looked up at both of them, her face bright with happiness. Does this mean Kellen's going to be my mom? The question hung in the cold air between them, full of hope and possibility and the kind of brave honesty that only someone Emma's age could manage. Lysander looked at Kellen, seeing his own answer reflected in her eyes. If she wants to be, he said softly. I want to be, Kellen whispered, and in that moment, everything else, the corporate threats, the legal battles, the uncertain future faded into background noise. What mattered was this: the three of them together, ready to fight for the life they were choosing to build. The next 2 weeks transformed Thornfield Valley in ways that had nothing to do with corporate development and everything to do with rediscovering what community could accomplish when it worked together toward a common goal. The community center became an unofficial headquarters, bustling with activity from dawn to dusk as residents organized their resistance to Meridian's acquisition plans. Kellen had turned one corner of the main room into a command center, complete with maps of the valley, legal documents, and a constant stream of phone calls to attorneys, environmental groups, and media contacts. Her corporate skills, once used to dismantle communities, now served to protect one. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure wasn't just a professional setback, it was the loss of everything she'd come to love. Lysander found himself taking on a role he'd never expected: community organizer. His natural tendency to help neighbors, combined with his lifetime knowledge of every family and property in the valley, made him the perfect liaison between Kellen's strategic planning and the practical needs of the residents. He coordinated work schedules so people could attend meetings, arranged carpools to legal consultations in the county seat, and served as translator when Kellen's explanations got too technical for folks who'd never dealt with corporate law. Collaboration between them was seamless in a way that surprised everyone, including themselves. Where Kellen had expertise but lacked local knowledge, Lysander filled the gaps. Where he had relationships but needed strategic thinking, she provided the framework. Emma, with the adaptability that came naturally to someone her age, appointed herself official document organizer and keeper of the coffee pot, role she took with absolute seriousness. Doc Morrison had volunteered his clinic as a secondary meeting space, and Maria Brennan had organized a phone tree that could reach every household in the valley within 30 minutes. Even Henrik Torvin, despite his recent health issues, insisted on using his connections with the County Historical Society to research Thornfield's eligibility for historical preservation status. The first major breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Kellen's attorney contacts delivered news that sent ripples of hope through the community. Margaret Clearwater, an environmental lawyer with a track record of successful cases against development corporations, agreed to represent Thornfield pro bono after reviewing the documents Kellen had provided. Meridian has a pattern, Margaret explained during her first visit to Thornfield, addressing a packed room at the community center. They target rural communities that they assume won't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. But they've made several procedural errors with your case, including inadequate environmental impact assessments and failure to properly notify all affected parties. The room buzzed with excitement, but Margaret held up a cautioning hand. This doesn't mean we've won. It means we have grounds to fight. But it's going to require sustained effort from all of you. Documentation, testimony, community solidarity. This isn't a battle that gets won in a courtroom. It gets won by proving that Thornfield is a thriving community worth preserving. That afternoon, Kellen and Lysander stood in the general store, which had become an unofficial information hub. Maps and legal documents covered the counter where customers usually paid for groceries, and the bulletin board was thick with meeting schedules and volunteer sign-up sheets. You know, Lysander said, studying a timeline Kellen had drawn up for their legal strategy. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be running a political campaign out of my store, I'd have thought they were crazy. Kellen looked up from the environmental impact report she was reviewing, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in a mountain town and fighting my former employer, I'd have had them committed. Emma appeared from behind the counter where she'd been sorting donated office supplies with the methodical precision of someone who'd inherited her father's attention to detail. I think it's good, she announced. Before, you were both just taking care of your own stuff. Now you're taking care of everyone's stuff. The observation was so simple and so accurate that both adults stopped what they were doing to really look at her. Emma was right somewhere in the process of fighting for Thornfield. They'd all become bigger versions of themselves. The community garden project was Maria Brennan's idea, born from a practical need that grew into something much more significant. If we're arguing that Thornfield is a thriving community, she'd said during one evening meeting, we need to show growth, not just resistance. We need to demonstrate that we're building something worth preserving. The plot of land behind the community center had sat unused for years, but within days of Maria's proposal, it was bustling with activity. Families brought tools, seeds, and expertise. The teenagers organized work crews. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age, insisted on contributing her grandmother's heirloom tomato seeds. Even the youngest residents got involved, painting markers for the various plots and helping to plan pathways between the growing areas. Kellen threw herself into the garden project with the same intensity she brought to the legal battle. Despite her complete lack of gardening experience, she appointed herself official soil tester and irrigation planner, approaching agriculture with the same analytical mindset she'd once applied to corporate acquisitions. You're treating those seedlings like they're merger documents, Lysander teased one Saturday morning as he watched her carefully measuring spacing between rows. They're more important than merger documents, Kellen replied seriously. These represent the future. Something we're building together that no corporation can put a price on. The truth of her words became evident as spring progressed. The garden wasn't just about vegetables, it was about proving to themselves and to any outside observers that Thornfield was a community investing in its own future. Children learned about sustainable agriculture alongside their grandparents. Neighbors who'd rarely spoken beyond casual greetings found themselves working side by side, sharing stories and building relationships that went deeper than proximity. More importantly, the garden gave everyone something hopeful to focus on while the legal battle continued. its slow progress through county and state agencies. Every sprouting seed, every successful transplant, every evening spent watering and weeding became an act of faith in Thornfield's permanence. The media attention began, slowly but built momentum as word spread about the small mountain community, fighting back against corporate encroachment. A local television station ran a feature about the garden project, framing it as a symbol of rural resilience. A regional newspaper picked up the story, focusing on Kellen's transformation from corporate executive to community defender. Former development executive turns tables on her industry, read the headline of the article that would eventually be picked up by state and national outlets. The story painted a picture of David versus Goliath, with Thornfield representing everything that was worth preserving about small-town America. But for Lysander, the most meaningful moment came on a quiet evening when he found Kellen sitting in the garden, her hands dirty from planting late-season herbs, watching Emma help Mrs. Patterson tie up climbing beans. Regrets? He asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench they'd built together the previous weekend. Kellen leaned into his shoulder, her voice soft with contentment. None. This is the first time in my life I felt like I was building something that mattered, something that would last beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. As if to emphasize her point, Emma's laughter drifted across the garden rows, followed by Mrs. Patterson's delighted chuckle as they discovered the first tiny tomatoes beginning to form on the heritage plants. This is what we're really fighting for, Kellen continued. Not just the right to stay, but the right to keep growing, together. Summer arrived in Thornfield Valley like a promise kept, transforming the community garden into a vibrant testament to what collective effort could accomplish. The legal battle with Meridian Development had stretched into its fourth month, but rather than wearing down the community's resolve, the extended timeline had given them something unexpected, the opportunity to prove their own worth in ways that went far beyond courtroom arguments. The victory against Meridian's first injunction had come in early July, when Margaret Clearwater successfully argued that the company had failed to complete required environmental impact studies. The judge's ruling didn't stop the development permanently, but it bought them time and required Meridian to restart their assessment process with proper community input. More importantly, it attracted attention from state environmental groups and historical preservation societies who began to take an active interest in Thornfield's case. But for Lysander, watching Kellen address a packed community meeting about the latest legal developments, the most remarkable transformation wasn't in their legal position, it was in the woman he'd fallen in love with. The polished corporate executive who'd arrived during the blizzard had evolved into someone who spoke with dirt under her fingernails and genuine passion in her voice. She'd learned to explain complex legal concepts in language that made sense to farmers and shopkeepers, and more importantly, she'd learned to listen when longtime residents shared knowledge that no law degree could provide. The environmental review process gives us approximately 6 months to demonstrate that Thornfield represents a viable, sustainable community, Kellen explained to the gathered crowd. But we're not just sitting back and waiting for bureaucrats to decide our fate. We're showing them and ourselves what we're capable of building together. The proof of that building was visible everywhere. The community garden had expanded twice, now encompassing not just vegetables, but herbs, medicinal plants, and even a small orchard where Emma and her friends had planted fruit trees that wouldn't bear for years to come. The garden had become a gathering place where neighbors lingered after tending their plots, sharing stories and planning new projects. Mrs. Patterson had become the unofficial historian of their efforts, documenting everything with photographs and careful notes. Her kitchen table was covered with binders full of before and after pictures, volunteer schedules, and newspaper clippings about their fight. Someday, she told anyone who'd listen, folks are going to want to know how a little mountain town taught a big corporation that community isn't something you can buy or sell. The success of the garden had inspired other initiatives. Doc Morrison had proposed updating the community center's kitchen to accommodate the harvest festivals they were planning. The Brennan family had started offering agricultural workshops, teaching sustainable farming techniques to anyone interested in learning. Even the teenagers had gotten involved, organizing a farmers market that drew visitors from neighboring towns and generated enough revenue to fund improvements to the community center. Lysander found himself busier than he'd been in years, but it was a different kind of busy than the desperate scrambling to keep his store afloat. Now he was coordinating projects, managing volunteer schedules, and somehow finding time to court the woman who'd become his partner in every sense of the word. Their engagement had been announced officially at the 4th of July celebration, with Emma serving as enthusiastic wedding planner and the entire community acting as extended family. The proposal itself had been perfectly imperfect, taking place on a Tuesday evening in the garden when they were both exhausted from a long day of legal meetings and community organizing. Lysander had simply looked at Kellen as she knelt between rows of tomatoes, her hair escaping from its ponytail and her face flushed from the warm evening air, and realized he couldn't wait another day to make their commitment official. "Marry me," he'd said, not romantically or formally, but with the practical certainty of someone who'd found exactly where he belonged. "Yes," she'd answered immediately, dirt-stained hands and all, and Emma had emerged from behind the beanpoles, where she'd apparently been eavesdropping, shearing and demanding to know when they could start planning the wedding. Now, 2 months later, wedding preparations had become another community project. Maria Brennan was coordinating flowers from the garden. Mrs. Patterson was hand-sewing Emma's junior bridesmaid dress. Doc Morrison had volunteered to officiate, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Even Henrik Torvin, despite his age and recent health concerns, insisted on contributing by building a wooden arch for the ceremony. The wedding planning had also provided an unexpected bridge to Kellen's past. Her parents, initially shocked by their daughter's dramatic life change, had gradually warmed to the idea of visiting Thornfield. Her mother, a retired teacher, had fallen in love with the community's emphasis on education and skill sharing. Her father, a small-town boy who'd made good in the city, recognized something in Thornfield that he'd lost along the way. "I haven't seen you this happy since you were Emma's age," Kellen's mother had told her during their most recent visit, watching as her daughter taught a group of neighbors how to preserve herbs from the garden. "You found something here that all that corporate success never gave you." The observation was true in ways that Kellen was still discovering. Her days were longer now, but felt fuller. Instead of managing other people's money, she was helping manage a community's future. Instead of analyzing market opportunities, she was creating opportunities for neighbors to learn and grow together. The skills were transferable, but the satisfaction was entirely different. The media attention had continued to build throughout the summer, bringing both opportunities and challenges. A documentary filmmaker had spent a week in Thornfield, creating a short film about community resistance that would eventually air on public television. A sustainable living magazine had featured their garden project in a cover story about rural innovation. Most significantly, their story had attracted the attention of grant-making foundations interested in supporting rural community development. "We've been approved for the Rural Sustainability Grant," Kellen announced at a mid-August community meeting, her voice barely containing her excitement. $50,000 for infrastructure improvements, educational programs, and economic development initiatives. The cheers that erupted from the packed community center were deafening, but Lysander noticed that Kellen's smile was tinged with something else, a recognition that their success was creating new responsibilities and opportunities they'd have to navigate carefully. The grant money opened doors they hadn't expected. Plans were developed for a community workshop space where residents could learn and teach practical skills. A small business incubator program was proposed to help local entrepreneurs start ventures that would keep young people in the valley. Most ambitiously, They began exploring the possibility of establishing Thornfield as a model for sustainable rural living, potentially attracting researchers and visitors interested in learning from their example. But with success came new challenges. The increased attention meant more scrutiny, more meetings, more paperwork, and more pressure to succeed not just for themselves, but as an example for other communities facing similar threats. Kellen, with her organizational skills and grant-writing experience, found herself coordinating with state agencies, nonprofit organizations, and academic institutions, work that was rewarding but demanded increasing amounts of her time. It was during one particularly overwhelming week in late August, when Kellen was juggling calls with 3 different foundations while trying to finalize Harvest Festival plans, that Lysander realized they needed to talk about what their success was costing them personally. He found her that evening in the garden, sitting on their bench with a laptop balanced on her knees and her phone pressed to her ear, still working despite the setting sun and the fact that she'd been going since dawn. Emma was beside her, doing homework by the light of a solar lantern they'd installed as part of the sustainability initiatives. "The conference call can wait until tomorrow," he said gently, closing her laptop. "Right now I need my fiancé, and Emma needs her soon-to-be mom to help us figure out what we're having for dinner." Kellen looked up, blinking as if she were surfacing from deep water. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in the foundation applications. The deadline is tomorrow," Lysander finished, "and it'll still be tomorrow after we eat. And after we spend some time together, that doesn't involve saving the world." Emma looked up from her math homework with the wisdom that seemed to come naturally to someone who'd watched the adults in her life balance love and responsibility. "Kellen, Dad's right. You're getting that look again." "What look?" "The look you had when you first got here. Like you're carrying too much by yourself." The observation stopped Kellen cold. She looked at Emma, then at Lysander, then around the garden where the evidence of their collective success surrounded them on all sides. Somewhere in the midst of fighting for their community, she'd slipped back into old patterns, taking on more than her share, working longer hours than were sustainable, treating every project as if its success depended entirely on her efforts. "You're right," she said quietly, setting her phone aside and really looking at the 2 people who mattered most to her. "I got scared that if I didn't do everything perfectly, we'd lose what we'd built. But that's not how this works, is it? This isn't something one person can maintain alone." Lysander reached for her hand, threading their fingers together in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "That's what I love about you," he said. "You care so much about making this work that you sometimes forget you don't have to make it work by yourself." That conversation marked a turning point in how they approached their shared responsibilities. Kellen began delegating more, training other community members to handle grant applications and media inquiries. Lysander took on more of the coordination with outside organizations, using his natural networking skills and deep community knowledge to build relationships with potential partners. Most importantly, they established boundaries around their personal time, protecting their relationship and their family life from the demands of their public roles. The Harvest Festival in September became the culmination of everything they'd built together, not just the garden produce and preserved foods, but the networks of relationship and mutual support that had grown alongside the vegetables. Visitors came from 3 counties to see what Thornfield had accomplished, and many left with ideas for their own communities. Local artisans sold crafts and products. The teenagers ran educational booths about sustainable agriculture. Emma, now 11 and full of confidence from her role in the community's transformation, gave tours of the garden to anyone who wanted to learn about their growing methods, standing at the edge of the festival as the sun set over the valley, watching families enjoy food they'd grown together and celebrate victories they'd won as a community. Lysander felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. Kellen stood beside him, her engagement ring catching the last light of the day. her face serene in a way that the driven executive who'd arrived in the blizzard never could have managed. "No regrets?" he asked, their traditional question after any major milestone. "Only one," she said, leaning into his warmth. "I wish it hadn't taken me so long to find my way here." Emma appeared between them, sticky-fingered from helping at the pie booth, and radiating the satisfied exhaustion that comes from a day well spent. "Are you guys being mushy again?" "Absolutely," Lysander confirmed, pulling her into their embrace. "And you're stuck with us." As the festival wound down and neighbors began the familiar ritual of cleaning up together, the lights of Thornfield Valley twinkled like stars against the darkening mountain sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new responsibilities. But tonight, they were simply home. The October morning of Lysander and Kellen's wedding dawned with the kind of crisp, golden clarity that only comes to mountain valleys in autumn. The aspen trees that lined the meadow behind the community center blazed yellow and orange against the deep blue sky, creating a natural cathedral more beautiful than any church could have provided. By 8 in the morning, the entire community was bustling with preparations, transforming the space where they'd fought so hard to preserve their way of life into a celebration of everything they'd built together. Emma, now 11 and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd helped save her town, directed the placement of flower arrangements with the authority of a seasoned wedding planner. The bouquets were entirely from their community garden, late-blooming sunflowers, herbs that still carried the warmth of summer sunshine, and trailing vines of sweet peas that Maria Brennan had coaxed into a second flowering just for the occasion. "Dad, your tie is crooked," Emma announced, appearing at Lysander's side with the critical eye of someone who'd been anticipating this day for months. She'd grown 3 inches since the spring, and her resemblance to her mother was becoming more pronounced with each passing season, though her personality was entirely her own, a blend of Sarah's warmth and Lysander's steady determination, with an additional layer of confidence that came from knowing she'd played a role in changing her community's future. Lysander submitted to his daughter's ministrations, marveling at how natural it felt to be nervous about marrying someone who'd been sharing his life for nearly a year. Kellen had spent the previous night at Mrs. Patterson's house, maintaining the traditional separation, and he'd slept poorly without her warm presence beside him. "You look handsome, Dad," Emma declared, stepping back to admire her work. "Kellen's going to cry when she sees you. Happy tears, I hope." "The best kind," Emma confirmed with the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed the full spectrum of adult emotions over the past year. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but guests had been arriving since noon, not just from Thornfield, but from neighboring towns and even some of the foundation representatives and legal team members who'd become friends during the long battle with Meridian. Kellen's parents had driven up from Chicago the previous week, her mother immediately enchanted by the community garden and her father spending long hours with Henrik Torvin, discussing the carpentry techniques that had gone into building the wedding arch. At exactly 1:45, as Doc Morrison took his position beneath the wooden arch that Henrik had carved with intertwining vines and mountain wildflowers, Lysander felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man simply trying to survive each day, protecting his heart from any possibility of further loss. Today, he stood ready to pledge his life to someone who'd taught him that love wasn't something to be guarded against, but something to be shared abundantly. The music began, Anna Brennan playing guitar while her mother sang, their voices blending in harmony that seemed to rise naturally from the mountain air itself. Emma walked down the makeshift aisle first, scattering flower petals with the solemn concentration the moment deserved. Her dress a perfect replica of one Mrs. Patterson had worn to her own wedding 60 years ago. Then Kellen appeared at the top of the meadow, and Lysander's breath caught in his throat. She'd chosen a simple dress the color of autumn leaves, her dark hair crowned with a wreath of the same garden flowers that decorated the arch. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped his heart. It was the expression on her face, the pure joy and certainty that radiated from her as she walked toward the life they'd chosen to build together. She carried no formal bouquet, instead holding a small potted seedling, a young apple tree that they would plant together after the ceremony, a symbol of the future they were creating that would bear fruit for generations to come. As Kellen reached his side, Lysander realized that his hands were steady for the first time all day. This was right. This was home. This was everything he'd been afraid to hope for. Doc Morrison cleared his throat, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. We're here today not just to witness a wedding, but to celebrate something much larger, the power of love to transform not just two hearts, but an entire community. Lysander and Kellen, your journey together began with an act of kindness on a stormy night, but it has grown into something that has changed all of our lives. The vows they'd written were simple but profound, reflecting the practical love that had grown between them through shared work and common purpose. Lysander spoke of finding in Kellen not just a partner, but someone who taught him that the heart had infinite capacity to expand when it was given permission to love freely. Kellen's voice broke only once as she promised to build with him not just a marriage, but a legacy of community and connection that would outlast their individual lives. When Doc Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that erupted from the crowd seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains, a sound of pure celebration that spoke to more than just one couple's happiness. This was a community celebrating its own survival, its own transformation, its own proof that some things love commitment. Home could not be bought or sold or taken away by corporate decree. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony to celebration, with tables set up throughout the garden and food prepared by dozens of hands. Mrs. Patterson's famous apple pies sat alongside Maria Brennan's harvest casseroles and dishes contributed by every family in the valley. Children ran between the tables and through the garden rows while adults lingered over coffee and stories. The boundaries between formal celebration and ordinary community gathering dissolving in the most natural way possible. It was during the dancing, as the sun began to set behind the mountains and solar lights twinkled throughout the garden, that Margaret Clearwater appeared at Lysander's side with news that would make their wedding day even more perfect. I have an early wedding present for you, she said, her professional composure cracked by a wide grin. Meridian Development Corporation has officially withdrawn their acquisition proposal for Thornfield Valley. Permanently. The news spread through the reception like wildfire, transforming the celebration into something even more joyous. Meridian, faced with mounting legal challenges, negative publicity, and the clear evidence that Thornfield was a thriving rather than dying community, had finally admitted defeat. More than that, the case had set a legal precedent that would make it much harder for similar corporations to target rural communities without proper environmental review and community input. It's over? Kellen asked, her wedding dress swirling as she turned from her conversation with Anna Brennan about the teenagers' college plans. It's over, Margaret confirmed. And more than that, your case has inspired legislation at the state level to strengthen community protection laws. What you've accomplished here is going to help communities across the region. As the news sank in, Lysander felt the last knot of tension he'd been carrying finally release. They'd won. Not just the legal battle, but something much more important. They'd proven that community, when it worked together with purpose and determination, was stronger than any corporate interest. The celebration continued well into the evening. But as the night air grew cooler and the older residents began to drift home, Lysander and Kellen found themselves standing together in the garden where so much of their relationship had grown. Emma was asleep on a blanket nearby, exhausted from the day's excitement, but unwilling to go inside and miss any part of the celebration. So, Kellen said, her voice soft in the darkness, we're officially a family now. We've been a family for months, Lysander replied, pulling her closer. Today just made it legal. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of their wedding guests enjoy the fruits of the garden they'd all created together. In the distance, lights twinkled from houses where their neighbors were settling in for the night, secure in the knowledge that their homes were safe, their community was strong, and their future was theirs to shape. 1 year later, on a sunny April morning that carried the promise of another abundant growing season, Kellen stood in the expanded community garden with a group of visitors from 3 other mountain communities who'd come to learn about Thornfield's model of sustainable rural living. The delegation included mayors, community organizers, and grant coordinators, all eager to understand how a small town had not only survived a corporate takeover attempt, but emerged stronger and more connected than before. The key, Kellen explained, gesturing toward the thriving plots where residents were already planting this year's crops, wasn't just fighting against something we didn't want. It was building towards something we did want. Every seed we planted, every skill we shared, every meeting we held, it all contributed to creating a community that was too valuable, too vibrant, too connected to be dismissed as expendable. Lysander watched from the general store's front window, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he observed his wife in her element. The store had expanded twice in the past year, now serving not just Thornfield residents, but the increasing number of visitors who came to experience their farmers' markets, attend their workshops, and learn about sustainable community living. More importantly, it had become a gathering place where neighbors still stopped to share news, ask for help, and maintain the connections that made Thornfield more than just a collection of houses. Emma, now 12 and serving as the official junior tour guide for community visits, was leading a group of teenagers from the visiting communities through the workshop space that had been built with grant funding. She explained with practiced ease how the space served multiple functions: woodworking classes taught by Henrik Torven, herb and medicinal plant processing led by Mrs. Patterson, small business development sessions coordinated by Maria Brennan, and after-school programs that kept local young people engaged in their community's future. The transformation of Thornfield over the past year had been remarkable not just in its scope, but in its sustainability. The initial burst of energy that had carried them through the crisis with Meridian had evolved into something deeper and more lasting, a culture of collaboration and mutual support that attracted new residents while retaining the community values that made the place special. 3 new families had moved to Thornfield in the past year, drawn by the combination of natural beauty, community spirit, and economic opportunity. A young veterinarian had opened a practice that served the entire region. A couple with expertise in renewable energy had started a consulting business that was helping other rural communities reduce their environmental impact. Most significantly, Anna Brennan had returned from her first year of college with plans to study sustainable agriculture and a commitment to bringing her knowledge back to help Thornfield continue to grow. Doc Morrison, now officially retired, but still serving as an informal advisor to the community's health and wellness initiatives, often remarked that Thornfield had accomplished something rare. It had changed dramatically while remaining fundamentally true to itself. As the afternoon tour concluded and the visiting delegation prepared to return to their own communities, Kellen found herself standing once again in the spot where she and Lysander had been married. The apple tree they'd planted together was showing its first tiny buds, a promise of future harvests that their grandchildren might someday enjoy. Emma appeared at her side, slightly out of breath from chasing some of the younger children through the garden paths. "Mom," she said. The word still brought a warm rush of joy to Kellen's heart every time she heard it. "Dad wants to know if you're ready to head home for dinner." "Almost," Kellen replied, looking around the garden one more time. The late afternoon light was golden and warm, illuminating the faces of neighbors as they tended their plots, children as they played among the pathways, and visitors as they took final photographs of a community that had captured their imagination. A year ago, she'd been a woman running from her own life, trapped in a career that demanded everything but gave back little of real value. Tonight, she would go home to a man who'd taught her that love was not a luxury but a necessity, to a daughter who'd shown her that family was not just about blood, but about choice and commitment, and to a community that had demonstrated the power of working together toward something larger than individual ambition. "Ready," she said, taking Emma's hand as they walked toward the store where Lysander was locking up for the evening. As they walked, Emma chattered about the day's events, her excitement about the visiting teenagers who might start their own community garden, and her plans for expanding the junior tour guide program. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd grown up, knowing that her opinions mattered, that her community valued her contributions, and that her future was full of possibilities. Lysander met them at the door, his smile as warm as it had been on their wedding day. "How was the tour?" "Educational," Kellen replied, slipping her hand into his as they began the short walk up the hill to their house. "Amazing to see how much we've accomplished, and how much other communities want to learn from what we've built." "Any regrets?" he asked, their traditional question that had become both ritual and genuine check-in. Kellen paused, looking back over the valley where lights were beginning to twinkle in house windows, and the community center was preparing for the evening's planning meeting about the summer festival. Somewhere in those lights were Mrs. Patterson, still documenting their community's story with photos and careful notes. Henrik Torvin, teaching his carpentry skills to anyone interested in learning. Maria and Jack Brennan, raising children who would carry forward the values of collaboration and mutual care. Doc Morrison, reading bedtime stories to his newest grandchild. Dozens of neighbors who'd become family, who'd proven that community was not just about geographical proximity, but about choosing to show up for each other day after day. "Not one," she said finally, "not a single one." As they reached their front porch, Emma racing ahead to let their dog out for his evening run, Lysander paused to look at the woman who'd transformed his understanding of what was possible. "I love you, Kellen Shaw." "I love you too," she replied, and in those simple words was contained the whole story of rescue and redemption, of community and commitment, of two hearts that had found in each other not just love, but the courage to build something lasting. Inside their warm kitchen, as Emma set the table and Lysander stirred the soup that had been simmering all day, Kellen felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Outside, Thornfield Valley settled into another peaceful evening, secure in the knowledge that some things love community. Home could weather any storm and emerge not just intact, but stronger than before. The blizzard that had brought them together felt like a lifetime ago, but its lesson remained clear. Sometimes the most unexpected storms bring exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. And sometimes, the people we rescue end up saving us in return. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.